Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for giving up some time this afternoon to come and join this Fabian Women's Network event supported by the Fawcett Society and the Cooperative Party Women's Network as well. I'm Sara Hyde. I'm the current chair of Fabian Women's Network. It is my utter joy and privilege to work with this amazing network founded by Seema Malhotra 15 years ago and home to hundreds of former mentees and thousands of women across the labour movement who are Fabian members, who by extension are members of Fabian Women's Network. Here we are on the eve of the US election and delighted to be running this. I know Seema is going to tell us much more about this particular event, but for those that are interested, we're running an event later this evening at 7:15 about Kamala Harris and what's at stake. We have a book club this Wednesday and many more events in the coming weeks, including one on the gender pay gap with our Shadow Chancellor Annalise Dodds on Thursday the 12th of November. To find out more, please look at all the normal channels, Facebook, Twitter, etc., or sign up on our website to our newsletter. We love to run events that encourage and promote women in politics and public life. So thank you once again for joining us today. I'm going to hand over to Seema and this illustrious panel without further ado for you all to enjoy this event. Seema.
Great, thank you very much, Sara, and thank you to you and Kelly and all at the Fabian Women's Network for hosting today. It is incredible that it actually has been 15 years this year since we founded the Fabian Women's Network, and I'm incredibly proud of the work that the network does, and indeed how it continues to flourish and make a huge contribution to our debate, nurturing women's talent in public life. Can I also thank the Fawcett Society and Cooperative Women's Network for their support today. 2 years ago in the UK, we marked 100 years since women got the right to vote and the right to stand in elections, and 90 years since women got the right to vote on equal terms with men. Events were held across the country celebrating the anniversary and asking the question about where we go next. There are currently 220 women members of the House of Commons, and at 34%, this is in fact an all-time high. And I believe I was the 366th woman ever elected to the House of Commons. We all have a statistic, which we had a photograph taken, in fact, of all of us holding our cards with our numbers. But since 1918, we've had 552 women elected to the House of Commons. The UK is, however, only 39th in the position of proportion of women in the lower house of Parliament. And so there's still a lot to do for us to think about how we progress in terms of power in society and the economy. Now, the story of how women got the vote in our nations is an important one to keep telling, and also to think about how we've progressed since and what the impact of women having the vote and having a greater voice in our national politics can achieve. And yet stark gender equality, we know inequality continues to exist. If you just look at the campaigning for gender equality that that UN women are now focused on as well for our equal place in power and in the economy. Women are earning less, have fewer savings, they're disproportionately more in the informal economy. Women have less access to social protections, more likely to be burdened with unpaid care and domestic work. And more likely, therefore, to drop out of the labour force. We also know that COVID-19 has had a disproportionate impact on women who are more likely to have lost their job, be shouldering increased unpaid work at home, and be experiencing mental ill health. So the impacts of crises, we know, are never gender neutral, and COVID-19 is no exception. Young women in London are also more likely to have lost their job and be suffering many of the other inequalities. And I'm sure that will also come out in the debate today. But there is also much to celebrate. And I know that we are going to have a fantastic session today with our exceptional speakers on what will be a fascinating discussion, which is also on the eve of the US elections. So I'm delighted to introduce our speakers in turn, starting with Judge Margaret McKeown, who joins us from San Diego today. Judge McKeown is a circuit judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and is based in San Diego from, as I said, from where she joins us. She serves on the board of the World Justice Project, the International Association of Women Judges. She's a member of the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences. She was also a White House Fellow and a Special Assistant under both Presidents Carter and Reagan. She served on the national boards of the Volunteers of America and Girl Scouts of America, and she also teaches regularly in Europe. Margaret is chair of the American Bar Association's Commission on the 19th Amendment. And the 19th Amendment was that which gave women suffrage on equal terms to men in America. She's editor of the 19th Amendment Cookbook, which was published in August, which is a digital cookbook that includes recipes from judges, Supreme Court justices, lawyers, scholars, and others connected to the legal field. The introduction to that cookbook notes that the suffragists published several cookbooks in their day. And in the aftermath and around the time of the 1918 flu pandemic, as marches and rallies were much like the time that we have today, reaching women through new means of campaigning with a message about suffrage was incredibly important. Those contributors to the cookbook include Amal Clooney, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and her daughter, Jane Ginsburg, Hillary Rodham Clinton, who offered a recipe around chocolate chip cookies, and many others. Margaret, I'm delighted and very proud to welcome you to join us today. And we would absolutely love to hear from you the story of it would be fantastic to share how the project came about, to know whether you had a favorite recipe, and to also answer an important question for us. The suffragists in America said that women voting would transform politics. Do you think that's happened? And where do you think is the next place to go for equality in America? Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, and thank you for having me today. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. Here we are in 2020, the centennial year for the United States Amendment that gave women the right to vote, although more precisely, the amendment said that no one should be denied the right to vote on account of sex. So the suffrage movement here in the United States lasted about 70 years, 3 generations. And interestingly, those who started it, most of them had died by the time it passed. And those who pushed it across the line were not even born at the time. So it was really quite a remarkable struggle. I think the suffragists were creative, they were indefatigable, and of course they were very strategic. 2 important events really influenced them, and also, I will say, the cookbooks they wrote. One is World War I, because women kept the home front going here and of course in many other countries. They worked in factories, they were frontline nurses, they worked in offices. But President Wilson opposed the amendment until finally they put pressure on him and said, if you promote democracy abroad, how can you restrict it at home? So that was one major problem. The second, of course, was the pandemic, and it literally shut down the country, but not the movement. So it's interesting how they quickly pivoted to think about different ways to get the message out. They used the mails extensively, they used radio, they used the print flyers, and they basically just switched their platform to try to reach people. And so an interesting thing is that cookbooks became a community tool for them. And it was a double entendre, of course. It showed that women could be out on the front lines promoting rights for women. At the same time, they could be at home cooking. And so they saw the cookbooks as somewhat of a messenger for their cause. And as one of them wrote, we go forth as a blessing for housekeepers. And of course, that's interesting language when you contrast it with the language that we might use today. So as she noted, I chair the American Bar's 19th Amendment Commission, and I wanted to do something that would last beyond 2020. When we started the commission, of course, we had several live events, one at Harvard, one that I did with Justice Ginsburg in Washington, D.C., and may have been really her last major public appearance. but I wanted something more lasting. So in 2021, 22, 23, people can look back and remember us, because a lot of times these events are really transitory and they don't leave anything for someone down the road. So I came up with the idea of a cookbook, which at first some people thought was sort of a silly idea until I explained the suffragists had cookbooks. And the timing couldn't have been better or worse, but the pandemic had hit and people were staying home and doing a lot of cooking. So with this idea, we solicited Supreme Court justices, international jurists, for example, Lady Brenda Hale from the UK, lawyers and media. And our goal was to get 100 recipes for 100 years. And the response was amazing. It was really quite an outpouring. When people sent their recipes, they came with stories of their great grandmothers and how they had been in the suffrage movement. Or in the case of Justice Ginsburg, her mother marched for suffrage in New York City. They came with photos, reflections about what the 19th Amendment had meant to them. And when we asked one person for a recipe, she said, I don't cook. I just call Uber Eats, which of course is one of these services that delivers food to your door. And I said, well, that isn't exactly a recipe, but everyone who lives eats in some way. So at least you must have a favorite recipe. So we got everything from very complicated multi-page recipes to a simple dip that basically says, put some sour cream and some spices together, and then you have a dip, because that person didn't cook at all. But for all the people who said they didn't cook, we got an enormous response from both men and women. As I mentioned, we got Yorkshire Parkin from Lady Brenda Hale. We got from the human rights lawyer Amal Clooney, pizza with pesto, and on the list goes. We got cookies from some people. And so we divided it into sections, just like a regular cookbook. And then we learned that in Washington State, the Collage Society had done a big exhibit of original art celebrating the amendment. So we asked them for permission, and their art is interspersed in the cookbook, along with a lot of the iconic messages that came out of the suffrage movement, and photos and quotations. So you asked me, what is my favorite recipe? I think that's like asking, which is your favorite child? Because after putting this thing together, I have a lot of favorite recipes, but in memory of Justice Ginsburg, I will say that my favorite recipe is the ratatouille recipe that she contributed. Now, I might add that she does not cook anymore. When she was on the Supreme Court, or even before that, the recipes came from her husband, Marty, with whom she had an amazingly loving relationship. And as he said, he was the first man to recognize her for her brain. He's called the Supreme Chef. And she really was such a trailblazer in the United States for gender equality. And once we were on a panel together and someone asked her, what's your secret to success? And she said, tongue in cheek, it's having a husband who cooks. So we know for her, her success was much, much more. She really changed, I think, globally, the conversation on women and gender. So when we put the cookbook together, we decided it should be free and distribute to everybody digitally. You can actually just type in to your browser 19th Amendment Cookbook.com, and up pops the cookbook with all the recipes. So here we were in 1920, and the amendment needed one more state for ratification. It was a very close fight. And there was one very young legislator, under 30 years old, a man. Of course, they were all men at the time. And he was wearing a red rose in his pocket, which meant he would vote against the amendment. And he had in his other pocket a letter from his mother. And she basically said, do the right thing, and went on to talk about the suffrage movement. So in the end, that one vote, he changed his vote and he pushed the amendment across the line. So I like to say it pays to listen to your mother. So now we've got the amendment. And the question is, would that transform politics? Yes. It was the largest expansion of democracy in American history, but it was not without its pitfalls, of course, because Black men and women were thwarted in going to the polls for years until we passed the 1965 Voting Rights Act. At the time that the amendment was passed, Native Americans were not considered citizens. And then over time that changed. So there were a lot of marginalized populations that were not immediately the beneficiaries, but were long-term beneficiaries. The amendment for the United States was really a springboard for the expansion of rights for women, because it, for the first time, put women at the table, and at least on paper, on equal footing with men. So where do we go next? Well, for starters, it's interesting because the suffrage movement was very successful out west where I live. And I grew up in a state called Wyoming, which was the first to grant women the right to vote in the 1860s, and when it became a state in the 1890s. And the hope is that with women voting, some people thought they would have a better chance of winning. And they also thought it would bring up the morals, elevate the morals of the Wild West. But interestingly, women generally did not diverge from the voting patterns of their husbands or men until sometime in the 1980s. So where do we go next in terms of women's equality? So much has been accomplished when we look back 100 years, but there's so much more to be done. First, I would say is pay equity, is that we remain in a situation where equal pay remains a tremendous challenge. Second, there was an effort in the 70s to pass another amendment called the Equal Rights Amendment. And that fell short after 10 years of politicking and pushing, and many states passing it, but not getting enough votes. So it was quite a different situation. The actual amendment in 1920 took only about a year from the time it passed Congress to the time it went through the states. But the Equal Rights Amendment, after 10 years, was unsuccessful. There's now another effort to put that forward. And on that note, I would say that because we have a federal system, we have a lot of power in the states. And so a lot of the action goes on in the states in terms of state legislation. And there are efforts there in terms of equal pay and also the Equal Rights Amendment. The third, I think we will continue to see legal challenges in the courts. Under our constitutional provision that provides equal protection, because for years women were not part of that equal protection, but case by case now, that what it means to have equal protection is becoming more nuanced and is being advanced. And finally, I think the impact of these 100 years shows that there is a challenge, but there are major efforts to put more women in executive positions, to put women in the boardrooms, in law firms, in management, in politics, and positions of power. So it would be wonderful for the suffragists to come back today, 100 years later, and to see the progress that has been made. But I think they would also tell us to keep cooking and to keep fighting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. That was incredibly inspiring and a brilliant scene setter for where we will go in our discussion today. I also would say that it was a very beautiful tribute in your own way to Justice Ginsburg, whose passing actually really reached here and was, you know, very much touched everybody here too. And I think was exceptional in the way that she and her story was able to reach, you know, across the world, and really kind of drew me to the cookbook as well in the role that she had in it. So thank you very much for setting out the stall and the challenges. I cannot think of a better person to follow that than Sam Smethers, who's our second speaker, and to lay out her perspective, because Sam is the CEO of the Fawcett Society, which is the UK's leading membership-based charity campaigning for gender equality and women's rights at work, at home, and in public life. And indeed, it is named after the British suffragist leader and social campaigner Millicent Fawcett. I've known Sam since the Fabian Women's Network was first set up, which I was thinking about the other day, when Sam worked for the Equal Opportunities Commission, as it then was, as Director of Public Affairs. And we were both involved together with the work of the Pensions Commission, that was particularly at that time important in looking to how we reformed women's access to pensions. Because what was the debate at the time particularly was that how female pensioners were experiencing lower levels of the occupational pension, had lower levels of employment, a greater tendency to be in part-time work, lower average earnings. I think the story in some ways has you know, continued to repeat itself, but we did make a huge amount of progress since then on the issue of women and pensions, though it's an example of the compounding of inequality through lifetimes, which ends up with women being poorer in retirement as well. Very topical for me, because I'll be taking the pension schemes bill through Parliament tomorrow. But Sam is an absolute force for change, including for the statue of Millicent Fawcett in Parliament Square. She also led the Fawcett Our Time Now campaign, celebrating 100 years since women secured the vote in the UK. So Sam, we'd love to hear from you today and to understand your perspective on how far you think we've come in terms of equality, where you think we need to go next. And I'm sure that you'll have some reflections on how our fight here reflects that very much of our sisters in America. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you very much, Seema. It's great to be here and to follow Margaret's contribution. And it's always lovely to mix the kind of history of the suffrage movement with the kind of modern day fight for equality, because we've got a lot we can learn from the women who have gone before us, and a lot of solidarity we can gain from looking through those sort of decades of history. You know, I always feel it's not only from the women that we're campaigning with today and alongside each other today that we can draw support and solidarity. It is very much about knowing you're part of that long heritage of a movement, and that also you can, with that kind of longer historical perspective, you can get a sense of just how far we've travelled and how far we've come. And when sometimes you're facing what feels like very slow progress in the present day, it really does help to just look back and remind yourself of what others have had to do, and all the kind of battles they've had to fight. And every step of progress that we've had, and I think I'm right in saying every single one, has had to be fought for and campaigned for. Nothing's been gifted to women on this long journey towards equality. And so that doesn't make it easy to do, but I think it does also remind us that it's part of the tradition of fighting for women's rights, and we've got a lot of strength that we can gain from all those sort of sisters that have gone before us. I also want to pay tribute to Seema and to Fabian Women's Network, who do fantastic work, and it's great to be there when it was launched 15 years ago, and I can't quite believe it is 15 years. But I know you do brilliant work supporting women to stand in politics, both at local level and national level. And, you know, we're doing a bit of that kind of work ourselves with our Equal Power project at the moment, which I'll say a bit more about. But it's really, really fundamentally important, both to keep that supply chain of women coming through into politics and encourage women to stand. And we know from our research that actually asking women to stand and supporting them to stand and giving them that solidarity and the role models and support of other women who are already there is really fundamentally important. But we also know we have to get the barriers out of their way. We have to make sure that we don't just encourage women to stand, but we change the politics and we change the institutions that they're actually standing in and for, and they need to be there to change it, but also our parties, our parliament and our local government all has a responsibility to change too. And so a lot of the work that Fawcett does is really about those structural barriers to equality and the things that are holding women back. So I wanted to share with you some of the findings from the research that we did actually a couple of years ago to mark that centenary of first votes for women. And it's important to recognise that not all women got the vote in 1918. Many women had to wait another 10 years. It was only those who had property or were over 30 who got the vote in the UK in 1918. But it's also important to understand that we need these steps along the way, and it's really, we wouldn't have had the vote, equal voting rights in 1928 if we hadn't got that first step in 1918. So this is all connected. It's all part of that journey towards equality and towards progress. I think that the other thing I think is always really difficult with this issue is that whenever we talk about it, we always talk about the difference women make. And we always talk about the difference it makes when they're not there. So if you look at the way COVID is playing out and the decision making in the UK government, and the absence of women in decision making has really had a massive impact on the way the government has rolled out, well, I say rolled out a strategy, it doesn't really have a strategy, it's the way it's reacted to events and crisis managed its way through this pandemic so far. And it's been completely in the absence of any kind of gender analysis, no thought about domestic abuse victims at the beginning when lockdown was first introduced in March, no support for childcare, no consideration of the impact of women, and particularly young women, low paid women, migrant women, of shutting down hospitality sectors, no real consideration of closing schools and the impact that has on maternal employment. Yeah, we've had one step after another where there's been a complete absence of thinking about women. And that's because women have been absent from that decision making. We have not seen them, we have not heard from them, and the people making the decisions aren't listening to them. And it doesn't seem to matter how many times we line up tens of thousands of signatures on petitions or organisations in campaigns, they're still not hearing it because we haven't got women at the decision-making table. So women in power is fundamentally important to impact on women's lives, and we see that both at local level with our local politics, and where that has a really significant and disproportionate impact on women, but also at national level in this pandemic right now. But really, we shouldn't have to keep justifying the place of women at the table, because women should be there by right, because it's about equality, and and it's about women in all their diversity. So making sure we have disabled women, Black, Asian, minority ethnic women there, that we get LGBT women, we make sure that we've got a representative democracy, because that's how we get better decision making, and that's what we should expect by right, because that's the morally right thing to do. But nevertheless, we end up very quickly into a place where we have to justify and say, well, the difference women make. And then when you look at the evidence, you can see very clearly what that difference is. So there was a study recently in Germany which looked at local politicians in Germany and found that for every woman elected at local level, there was a 40% increase in childcare provision. So you could actually translate women's representation into childcare provision in terms of the impact it had on the locality. And that's by looking at a big sample of local candidates. So we know that women are more likely both to talk about the issues that impact directly on women's lives, and also to make that difference, to actually enact those practical changes, because women want to make a difference to women's lives. And we can see that through our own local politics in the UK and through our national politics, with the work that, but Seema is doing on pensions now, and others are doing in terms of amendments to the domestic abuse bill, campaigns for Sure Start and childcare and so on in the past. So getting women into politics makes a big, big difference and impact on women's lives. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about where we still need to go next, because I think that is really, really important, because there are still huge barriers that have to be overcome and huge changes that need to be made. We're stuck at about a third of women MPs. Labour's done well, it's got to 51%, but other parties unfortunately haven't done quite so well. And we're stuck at about 34% now in Parliament, local government the same. And actually, in terms of the combined authorities and devolution, is even worse. None of the metro mayors are women, only 1 in 5 combined authority representatives are women. And so we've created a tier of government that's very heavily male dominated. So what do we need to change? We need to make changes at local level, in terms of improving the culture of local politics, tackling harassment and abuse in our local politics, and also the way we select our local candidates. We need to make change at national level in terms of the way we, again, select candidates and the kind of biases that are still seen, very, very visible and deliberate bias is seen and imposed on candidates standing at elections. The research we did 2 years ago found that women were still being asked about where their children were going to go to school and how they were going to do the job, whether they were going to be able to look after their family and do the job. Yeah, they were getting questions like that in the selection process, and other stories where women were saying, well, we just can't have a young woman. Someone had made this comment in the selection process, we just can't have a young woman here. This is in 2018 and during that process of selecting candidates in 2018. So it's really still fundamentally with us. Misogyny is very much alive and present in our politics, and it's also intersecting with other forms of discrimination and abuse and hate that women experience, and women of colour in particular experience. And we've got to change our parliament. So, we've seen harassment in our parliament. We've seen even now, an MP accused of rape who has not been suspended from the House, who is still hasn't been dealt with by his party. These are still part of the feature of our politics, despite all the pressure there's been for reform. These institutions resist change, and so it has to be a sort of renewed effort on the part of all the parties and the part of all the great women and supporters and allies we work with across all those parties to really drive that change and to tip us into what we hope will be a bit of a step change in women's representation in our politics. And fundamentally, we need very deliberate mechanisms. So change in the culture is really important, but actually, in order to overcome those barriers, sometimes you have to have a very deliberate tool, such as All Women Shortlists, which we know has worked and served the Labour Party well, and there are other parties that are also looking at it as well now. Finally, I just wanted to say that the thing that struck me most about the last few years of working with politicians in Parliament and at local level is just how much collaboration there is between women in particular in our politics. It's a lot stronger now, I think, than ever. So it's a really positive feature of politics that's been more present, I think, in recent years than perhaps it has in the past. And I think some of the work we did in the centenary year was very much about that. It was about bringing women together across those party divides in order to address what is a woeful underrepresentation of women in our politics and our public life. So I think that bodes well for the future. I think there is still a prospect of more of that. And so we facilitate the APPG and Women in Parliament, which is very much about that collaborative cross-party working, and long may that continue, because we're going to need that. We're going to need women to come together, particularly in response to this pandemic, as we look to the future and look to how we emerge from this and deal with the disproportionate impact on women and girls, and what has been, I think, something that has set equality back and set us back in terms of particularly workplace equality, potentially for decades. We're going to need a renewed effort to really put gender equality at the front and centre of that, and to address all that sort of structural inequality that so many women face. So I'll stop there, and I'm sure we're going to have a really interesting discussion. And I want to say a massive thank you to Seema for inviting me, and to the Fabian Women's Network. Solidarity with everything you do, and look forward to having the discussion with all of you.
Thank you very much, Sam, and really for all that you're doing and all that your team at Fawcett are doing, and your comments around changing culture, around our processes, around tackling bias, what we need to do in positions of power and places of power, as well as in society, I think leads us very neatly into our third speaker, who I'm incredibly proud and pleased to have joining us, Marsha de Cordova MP, who is the Labour Member of Parliament for Battersea and Shadow Secretary of State for Women and Equalities. She's also served as the Shadow Minister for Disabled People, and has been involved as well in campaigning to make the parliamentary estate more accessible as well for disabled people. Marsha is an absolute inspiration and has been a force as well in how we have needed to respond to the Black Lives Matter message and movement, and also how we need to, to look to our politics and policy to see a more equal society and a more equal economy. So Marsha, I'm delighted to welcome you to share your thoughts on, and also where you see the priorities lying for where the campaign for equality needs to go next. Marsha.
Thank you, Seema, and can I just say thank you to you and the Fabian Women's Network for just all the incredible work that you continue to do. I'm really pleased to be part of this panel discussion today with these fantastic women, and really grateful to be here, especially this week of all weeks, which I'm sure we're all hoping and praying that we will bring the first female African-American vice president in the United States tomorrow. I certainly have got everything crossed for that. But we know, obviously, the United States are celebrating their centenary, where some women got the right to vote in 1920, but we know it wasn't until a number of decades later that all women could vote, and it was a similar process here in the UK, which Sam's already alluded to. But that sometimes change comes by incremental steps, don't they? It just goes to show we can't always have everything at once. And but even now more, I think women are a powerful force to be reckoned with, deciding elections by voting at higher rates than men have ever done, particularly in the US presidential elections since the 1980s. But one thing that we all have to fight and overcome is the inequalities and injustices that still exist, and nothing more than the global pandemic and the economic crisis has exposed and amplified some of those underlying structural inequalities that are faced by women. For instance, if we look at the gender pay gap, it still sits stubbornly at 18%, both here in the UK, but also in the US. And, at the start of our pandemic, one of the first things the British government chose to do was to suspend gender pay gap reporting, and there's no date in sight as to when they plan to reinstate it. But we also have the crisis that this pandemic has exposed around things like childcare for women. The UK is probably already the most expensive place in Europe, and the crisis in childcare is especially affecting our single mothers the most of any group. But also there's the crisis within pay in itself, for we know that in both the UK and the US, female-dominated workplaces such as retail and hospitality are some of the most low paid. And we know that women make up around 63% of workers who earn what's called a federal minimum wage in the US. And we know that many low paid workers are women in this country and are also young. But I think it's important when we talk about women's equality that we have to also acknowledge how it all intersects with other areas as well. So, for example, when we look at poverty in the US, it stands at around 21.4% for Black women compared to the national poverty rate, which is around 7%. And we know that in the UK, if you are Black, Asian, or from an ethnic minority, you are more likely to be living in a poorer household. And nothing more could be a testament to that than the last 10 years of the austerity measures that were imposed on us that disproportionately affected and impacted on the lives of women, particularly when it came to public spending and public services. And we saw just the impact that had, whether that was on low pay, but the fact that a majority of women are recipients of social security support. And obviously many women within the public sector labour force were far more likely to experience pay freezes and also job cuts. And women have also been more likely to be taking on most of the caring responsibilities within the home, which are naturally unpaid. So there is this case where whilst we've achieved some things, we still do have a long way to go. And part of this change comes around representation. And although Sam has alluded to it, I think this is where we really are able to exercise our power and to bring about that change by having greater representation. Obviously the first woman to be elected as an MP was in 1918, but obviously 101 years or 2 years on later from that, we still make up just over 34% of all MPs. And in local government, that's just a little over 34% itself, where there are women represented. And if we're talking about Black women or women from other ethnic minorities, obviously the numbers will be even smaller. And I'm proud of the Labour Party's record when it comes to women. We were the first party to introduce all women shortlists. And at the last general election in December 2019, 77% of the new Labour MPs were women. And obviously that was also a year where we also elected the most ethnic minority MPs across the board. But I have to do a shout out to the US and say, you know, in your 2018 midterm elections that you elected a record number of women. I think it's 102 women were elected to the House of Representatives. And obviously, whilst that's still not enough, it also represents just how women are taking their spaces in those realms of power and recognizing their role and the role, recognizing their role and the overwhelming difference that they can actually make in occupying some of those spaces. But it brings me on to where we need to kind of get to in terms of our fight and for equal power and equal justice. And, you know, there is the call continuously to ensure that, you know, women are represented at board level and within the equities of all different occupations and professions. But I think in the immediacy, we need to ensure that there's a proper gendered response to the COVID-19 pandemic. There isn't an end in sight, and we know that current responses by the UK government clearly demonstrate that there aren't women around those decision-making tables making some of those decisions, and you know, that really does need to change, where we actually ensure that equality is at the heart of what we are trying to do. So just a few things I would also suggest, you know, in their response, it's ensuring that they really firstly carry out what are called equality impact assessments on their strategic approach, but also using these assessments to help shape and improve their policy making, because at present that's not happening. Obviously, we want to see them restart the mandatory gender pay gap reporting, and I want them to go a step further and look at introducing ethnicity and disability pay gap reporting, because in all of those spaces, women are obviously disproportionately represented as well. We need a proper response to how we handle the childcare crisis, ensuring that it's not just affordable, but it's also accessible. So, for example, in a European country, Belgium has implemented a special COVID-19 parental leave to help balance home and work. That's potentially something that other countries should also be looking at, but also ensuring that there's proper sustainable funding for services which supports women fleeing domestic abuse. We also need to think about how we can address decriminalisation of rape and introduce an effective and a renewed violence against women and girls strategy, which hasn't been done by this government to date. So they're just a few steps or measures that also can be taken. But some of the practical steps how we need to get more women, not just into politics and into, you know, at a local level, at a national level, but also in government. And this means providing more training, ensuring that, you know, we can retain a women shortlist within the right legal frameworks, and mentoring, but also tackling some of the abuse that women get within politics. We know that online abuse is rife, particularly for women, but particularly for ethnic minority women as well. So all issues that need to be tackled, and that's why it's so important that we have to also look at intersectionality in terms of the wider piece. But obviously, you know, there is the Equality Act, which does also need to be strengthened. But, you know, looking at areas that are already in existence, like Section 106, which will require all political parties to collate and publish their data on their candidates in terms of their ethnicity, and that would be across all governments, including our devolved nations as well. And these are just some of the small but significant steps that can be taken to ensure that, you know, we have equal power, but also there's, you know, a gendered response to how we tackle some of the inequalities that continue to play a part in our society going forward. So Seema, I'll leave it there, but thank you so much for allowing me to be part of what has been a fantastic discussion. And can I say thank you to Margaret and Sam also for their incredible contributions. And I've already put the book into Google, the 19th Amendment Cookbook. So I'm there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Marsha. I think everybody will probably be taking a recipe or two through our lockdown as well. And I really want to open up the discussion to those who are in the Q&A. I'm not sure how this works exactly, because I know that there's a couple of people who indicated they want to speak, but I think it's helpful if you're able to just write into the Q&A if you can come in. I've got Sharon Clare, who's from Credit Suisse Women's Network, that wants to come in. I'm not sure if we're able to unmute her or if she can type a question into the Q&A. And then I think there were a few others, but we've had one question, I think, from Manjeet Butta, which is saying that we've had presidents in the United States from the main parties, and also in the UK government from different parties, but we've had 2 women prime ministers in the UK, and so I think this is really a question about asking what more we can do to keep pushing for equality and better and more empowerment for women in sort of in places of decision making. So I know we've touched on that with getting women into positions, but also women being at the decision making table, which I think the COVID experience is highlighting. There are, where are the women in the sort of core decision making, and has that led to not having women's voices and therefore women's issues as represented as much. So I don't know if anybody wants to come in on that a little bit more, and then we'll see if we can either allow participants to speak or to put their questions in the Q&A.
Seema, can I start off? What I would say, I think, thank Manjeet for that question, and I think it's so important to really, we have to look at this practically, because whilst we've had two female prime ministers, this is no criticism of them, but gender equality wasn't on the top of their agenda. So it's really important, everybody has a role to play in this. But I think the most practical thing we can do is about encouraging our sisters to put themselves forward. It's encouraging our sisters to know that they can do it and not feel as though, their background or, their upbringing or the work they do, or, so many different issues and aspects or barriers can prevent them from wanting to kind of take that leap and lean into wanting to be part of the decision-making process. We are yet to have a female president, but we've certainly had an African-American president, which for me is huge progress. And in this country, it is high time that we have a female prime minister that absolutely wants to take forward a gendered response to some of the challenges and the inequalities that we face. But it's really about asking women to get involved and making sure those spaces are inclusive and they're accessible for women to be able to do that as well. Those are just some of the practical things that I think we need to start looking at.
That's fantastic. I'm going to just bring in.
Can I jump in there, Seema, as well?
Yeah, Sam, I'll bring in Sharon first, because then I think you'll be able to come back on maybe a couple of points, just because we've got Sharon. Sharon, I think, can we hear you now?
Hi everyone. Hello, Seema, and thank you for a really interesting and insightful panel. So I've worked in the finance and banking industry now for around 20 years, and I've been involved in a number of different women networks. And what I have heard are reoccurring themes from women, particularly in this industry, around promotion and progression, about being heard and visible in what is still a very male-dominated industry, and of course getting into leadership and the C-suite. I wanted to ask the panelists what their views were on how these industries and others can get a better balance at more at senior levels and more in the boardroom. I mean, how do you think women can overcome these challenges? I mean, obviously they also will be juggling, potentially motherhood and other responsibilities, or take leave from their careers, and of course, as well as the issue of gender pay and equality.
Sam, do you want to come in first? I think you can take both questions.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. Well, I think there are things that institutions and organisations really have to do to address what are sort of persistent, recurring barriers to women. And I think the research we did a couple of years ago really shone a light on that. So asking women to stand absolutely does make a difference. We could see that. It really became clear that the women candidates and women MPs who've been successful were much more likely to have been approached multiple times before they put themselves forward. So not just once, but multiple times to encourage them to stand. But then you also then do have to deal with the practical and structural barriers that they face. So they're less likely to be able to travel around the country chasing seats. They're less likely to be able to relocate their entire lives on the off chance of getting a seat and being successful. So they are facing more constraints on those in terms of practicalities. They're less likely to have the money available to them to do what they want to do. And then they're also more likely to face those sort of stereotypical, very kind of biased questioning through the process. So you do have to address the people who are dealing with the selections. You've got to manage that, you've got to train them, you've got to make sure there's some quality control on that process. And then you've got to deal with the culture, which is still quite a kind of a negative culture, almost a misogynistic culture within our parties and within our parliaments and local government, and all of these things are interrelated. And in terms of what you do in the corporate world, I think, again, those very practical, tangible things such as quotas, targets, proportionate progression, where you've got 40% at one level, so you try and move 40% of candidates up to the next level. Those sorts of mechanisms do make a difference to getting more women into those sort of senior positions. But real leadership, real sponsorship from the top, from men as well as women in those senior positions, to really actively promote and encourage women to come forward and to keep challenging and questioning why that's not happening. So to look at the data in their own organisations, which is why gender pay gap reporting has been useful, actually, because it has forced organisations to look at themselves and ask that question. And I totally endorse what Marsha's saying as well about extending that now to ethnicity pay reporting in particular, because we're really ready for that. That needs to come. But we have to have those very deliberate mechanisms, and sometimes they're clunky and sometimes they're imperfect in themselves. But you have to leap over a barrier, you have to have an intervention like that to really make a difference.
Great. Margaret, do you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. I want to first just make one disclaimer, and that as a member of the court in the United States, I don't take positions on political issues or elections. And I emphasize that because we are on the eve of an election. But on the question that you raise about getting women into the C-suite and positions of power, I have two observations that really echo the other speakers. We have in California the first state to pass what was called the Women on Board Act. And it requires those corporations publicly held that are headquartered in California to have at least one woman on the board. It sets a deadline for that. And it's a first step, and it's a start. I know that's been done in Europe much more frequently than it has been done in the United States. So California is the first step to take that step legislatively. The second thing I would echo is the importance of sponsorship. And I've seen that really through the eye of public servant and also a lawyer. And that is, I think that we all have a responsibility not to just lean in for ourselves, which became a big rallying cry. And I'm not a big advocate of that. I'm more an advocate of leaning down and lifting up, because all of us have really been the beneficiaries of those who've gone before us. So we just need to keep reminding ourselves to look around, to see who's out there, to see who might need an extra push, to see who we can help, because I think it makes an enormous difference. You can pass legislation, you can have speeches, but it is almost a retail effort of combining all of that with individual women and men stepping up to the plate.
Thank you very much, Margaret. I think it's so interesting and so helpful to have a dialogue that is kind of two nations working together on a similar journey and at different stages. A lot that I think we can learn from each other. I know Marsha's going to have to go in a few minutes, but we've got one question that I do want to take Marsha's view on, and then perhaps Marsha can just sort of make some just a closing comment before she leaves. It's from Roz, and I think it's talking about how multinational companies should stop apologizing for not doing more, and start including women and ethnic minority women as well. And I think it really is sort of suggesting that we might want to move more towards quotas or targets in some form for ethnic minorities and for women on boards. I know we've had the debate about that for public boards, where we did have that previously. Marsha, I'd be very interested in your view on that, and perhaps if you can say final words as well before you go. You're on mute.
Thank you. Yes, just unmuted myself. So thanks, Roz, for that question. Look, Seema, I think the challenge we're facing here is that we're in a place in 2020 where we are still going to need to start taking some positive actions if we're going to be really serious about wanting to increase representation and leadership across boards, but also across multinational companies, and also within our political spheres as well. And I think the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly here in the UK, has really helped to kind of start having those conversations once again. Because it's just not good enough for a board just to have one single woman on it, or for a board to think that they can just have one ethnic minority on it and their job here is done. There has to be a real meaningful actions, and that's why, you know, things like having a proper robust race equality strategy which seeks to also address the power structures, but also representation and leadership, and obviously addressing structural racism is so important in these spaces, because that's when we're going to start seeing meaningful action. Because I don't know about anyone else, but, you know, apologies and so forth aren't really cutting it. It's really going to be about the concrete actions that need to now start taking place for us to say, you know, there's got to be some progress, or else structural and institutional racism or sexism will continue if we don't just say these are the actions that need to take. And they've got to be some positive actions. All women shortlist work, right? We did that in 1997 and it absolutely worked. And, you know, other parties are now looking at that because they recognize in some ways, you know, if we want to achieve equality, we're going to have to take some positive actions to doing that.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Marsha, and for joining us today. We look forward to the next event.
Well, thank you very much, and it's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you for having me. And here's to a great election night tomorrow. She keeps saying, hopefully.
Thanks, Marsha.
Bye.
I'm going to bring in another question as well, and then open this up to Sam and Margaret. It's building on that, but it's asking the question: do you think we need more female editors of major media networks so that the coverage of stories about domestic violence against partners in the media or courts makes it easier for victims and survivors to come forward? I'm sure that we can extend that out a bit to other professions as well, but very interested in your take on that and how we actually make the difference in terms of numbers at the top. Sam, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real problem in terms of, you know, power and who dominates. Right, so our media is no different. So I think it was only the editors of women's magazines where women dominated those editor roles, if you see what I mean, when we did our sex and power audit in January this year. But every other media platform is, again, very much dominated by men, and you can see it. And, you know, the online world, to be honest, is probably, you know, the digital platforms is really where the power now and the future lies, you know, so you can totally see all the kind of impact of the way those platforms are policed, you know, their failure to take down abusive content, for example, a failure to respond when women complain about some of that content, misogynistic content, where you've got algorithms working in a way that's very much biased, both in terms of gender, but also race, you know, so again, very damaging power bias is built into those algorithms, which are very powerful and then can drive decision making, can drive the way those sorts of platforms operate. So it's much more than the kind of traditional media now. It's sort of writ large, and that's, you know, one of the great strengths of social media has obviously been individuals having a platform and individuals being able to communicate directly with audiences. So it's been a great tool for feminists and a great tool for campaigners, but it's also been a major issue in terms of the way those platforms and the way that sort of digital media plays out against women, and mobilising those who would really want to, you know, turn the clock back on equality. And we can see that happening daily in our social media platforms. I think in terms of what do we do about that, I think really a lot of the kind of tools and mechanisms we talked about in terms of representation apply where you've got institutions and structures. I think it's more problematic and difficult where it's so fragmented. But the sort of big global power structures that are, you know, Google, Facebook and Instagram, and, you know, all of these companies now, you can see how much money they've made just in the lockdown period. They're huge profits they're returning now. So we've got to think about the way we access some of that resource, where they get them to take more responsibility, and how that can support and address some of the inequalities that we're dealing with right now.
Great, thank you. Margaret, did you want to come in?
I really echo what Sam said. The question is, what is the press? And if you asked a decade ago, that would be a very easy question to answer. And now, of course, what is the press is so diffuse, because it's not just the major media outlets, which used to be thought of as the major newspapers and the major networks. And that's no longer the true anymore. We, of course, in the United States have a very robust First Amendment and right to freedom of speech. There's a big difference in the United States and UK in terms of defamation, for example, and how we treat that. So one of the things that we're seeing, because the internet knows no borders, is we're seeing these collisions often between internal values of different countries or internal regulations of different countries, and how does that apply to an internet which is really has this global reach. The last thing I'll say is that, you know, the internet has been such a game changer in so many ways for the population, legally, in terms of how we think about it, and it's hard to believe that it's just, you know, really been in any common use since the mid-90s, and even then not significantly until into the 2000s. But I think the other thing we've seen is the dark side of the internet. And here I think particularly of bullying and harassment and human trafficking, which are all facilitated by a world where it can be done, so to speak, behind the scenes. So while we in the United States continue to have a very robust First Amendment and freedom of speech, we're also cognizant of, you know, the dark side. And I'm not talking just about, you know, the dark internet, but really about the dark side of what has happened to women as a consequence of the internet. So there are many organizations that are working very hard in these areas, women's organizations and others. And so I think this online bullying, online harassment, online sex trade is really going to be a major challenge down the road.
Yeah, I don't think we've really talked about that as much as we need to, and I think this is definitely a space to come back to, and to how we think about what media is today. So thank you for those comments and for the question. I'm going to bring in Emma Stevenson, who I think we've managed to unmute or to bring in, and hopefully there'll be then one final question before we hear from Maria. So we've got Ria as well. So Emma, if I can take you first, and then Ria, and then we'll take final comments, and then I'll bring in Maria.
Thank you, Seema. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Great, thank you. This has been really, really inspiring. And as a young woman who's interested in the sort of the history and the future of the movement, I just sort of wondered if any of the panelists have any suggestions for the best resource for young people to teach themselves about the history of women's suffrage and about the achievements and best practices of intersectional feminist movements across the globe today.
Fantastic question, and I suspect that Margaret might start with the cookbook, but we'll wait and hear. And Ria, if you want to ask your question, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Hi there, can you hear me?
We can.
Hi, thank you very much for a really, really interesting discussion, and of course very well timed. I'm the fourth coordinator of the Cooperative Party Women's Network, and for those of you that don't know, we work to increase participation in party structures and elected office of women. And of course, I think I would be amiss not to mention the fact that cooperatives promote gender equality pretty innately, so we're quite well positioned. But my question is actually about just asking the panel what they feel are the unique barriers to the election of a woman to the US presidency, given the fact that the UK has seen 2 female prime ministers now, and of course the outcome of the past election saw a very experienced Hillary Clinton lose out to Donald Trump. Obviously there are lots of other factors, but I wondered if the panel might share some thoughts on what those unique barriers might be. Thank you.
Great. So I'll bring in Sam and then Margaret, and if you can also, I think, just say a couple of closing words will be fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, just quickly on the point about resources, there are lots of great resources. I'm rubbish at remembering specific names and things, so I'm not going to try and remember them all now, but I'm happy to send an email with some links and you could forward that on to your attendees perhaps after the event. There's a great exhibition at the British Library at the moment, which I know is going to be subject to lockdown probably shortly, but that's all about feminism and the history of the fight for women's rights, and so I'd recommend that. There's also Millicent Fawcett's brooch, donated by Fawcett on long loan to the Museum of London at the moment, which is part of their suffrage exhibition, so I'd encourage you to go and see that. And you know, the reason for mentioning those is often it's good to get kids into museums rather than just produce books and literature for them. And then there's a link which I'll send you to a sort of feminist mini feminist shop which has got loads of great resources on as well. And we produced some stuff on the Fawcett website a couple of years ago for Centennial of Women's Votes that was used in our schools outreach work that we did that year. So again, I can send you the link to that too. UK Feminists do great work targeting young women, particularly in promoting feminism as well, for example. So there's lots of good stuff out there, and just search for it really and you'll find it. And there's a great book as well that we sell, which is the history of the Fawcett Society, but it's really all about the history of the suffrage movement, and that's got some great quotes and images in it too. And why hasn't there been a woman president? Well, misogyny. I mean, look what happened to Hillary when she stood. Look at how she was appallingly treated. You know, you could see that really she's one of the most powerful women in the world at that point, really, and would have been, you know, a very, I think, a really effective president if she'd have got the chance to become so. But being in a position of power and influence as she was at that time didn't prevent her from suffering the most appalling misogynistic abuse, both from the wider media and through the campaign, and also from the opponents she stood against at the time. So that's the reason I say you haven't had one yet.
Seema, do you want me
Margaret,
to?
final comments.
All right. Just some quick comments. The resources are amazing. We, of course, had a traveling exhibit this year along with some historical societies, but it had to quit traveling because no one could come see it anymore. But if you look online for the United States Library of Congress, the United States National Archives, and also the American Bar Association 19th Amendment, I echo Sam that there are these incredible resources, and we learn from history. There was one woman in 1872, even before suffrage passed, who tried to run for vice president, which is kind of interesting. And so there are these resources, and I think one of our Supreme Court justices said years ago that an ounce of history is worth a pound of logic. And so I think it does pay to go back and look at history. And finally, fast forward, it pays to be involved in something. And there are so many organizations and others that are crying out for young people to get involved. And so I think that is really important. And just asking the question is the first step. So I just want to thank the Fabian Women's Network, Fawcett Society, and others, Seema for putting all this together. I think it's really interesting to look, as they used to say, across the pond and see what the similarities and differences are. But I think we share so much in heritage and so much in outlook that I've learned a lot from the program, and I hope you'll continue these. So thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you very much, Margaret. And I want to bring in a very special woman to also say some just closing words and do a vote of thanks. Maria Morgan is a social worker by trade and CEO of Kineara, which she set up in 2012 to prevent homelessness by supporting people who are at risk of eviction to stay in their homes with their rent support program. And she works with families and individuals on a whole range of support and mobilizing services around them. She was very inspiring to me when we met recently during the London Challenge Poverty Week. And I'm very delighted to welcome Maria to say a few words of reflection at the end of the event today.
Oh, thank you, Seema. Thank you, everybody. It's been really great being a part of the discussion and listening. I'm just honoured to be a part of, be amongst such great women. So thank you for having me today. Just want to say thank you for Seema. She's an inspiration, and the Fabian Women Network, what you've done is absolutely amazing, and just keep going. We need networks like yours. We need networks like the Coop, I think it's the Co-op Women Network, Fawcett Society. Amazing work, and just want to celebrate you today and many women that's on this call. Also want to thank you for Margaret, amazing work that you're doing. I just want to say thank you to you all. There's a few things that came out at me when I was hearing the discussion, and one was how significant the Cookbook is, and how really how strategic it was for those women to use that book to actually facilitate their voice and to be able to go out there. The suffragette women, what they did with that cookbook was amazing. Whether you are part of that nature nurture debate, they use the stereotype of women cooking and use that as a vehicle to say, okay, then you believe women belong to the kitchen, we're going to use it and we're going to get votes. And I think the tenacity of that and where it brought women to is absolutely amazing. So having a book again, I've downloaded the book. I've shared it with my team as well. And yeah, I'll be looking at those recipes as well. So thanks for sharing that. The other kind of area I wanted to speak about is how interesting and how sometimes dangerous historical systemic equality has in our society today, how it's really grown in part of our society, and how we're now unpicking those inequalities, how we're being forced to look at inequality, how we're forced to look at race inequality and women inequality. And when you have a society that has have a history of those thinkings engraved in the way people think, it's going to take time to begin to unlock those kind of roots, and having women like who's been speaking on the panel and many other organizations in this space, it's going to take time, but we can't give up. We can't give up. We have come this far and we can't give up. We've got too much blood shed, too much hard work, too much sleepless nights for us to give up on this vision. Let's keep going. The other thing I wanted to mention is also the importance of women leadership, the importance of, I agree with Margaret, what Margaret was saying, looking down and pulling up, looking at the women in our network, looking at girls and boys in schools and education? How can we start to change the narrative? How can we start to get young people thinking about women's right, not as a way to say, okay, we're ostracizing anyone, but saying actually we have a voice, and the voice, it needs to be heard. And how can we look at our own network and say, what am I doing to install a different mindset in the next generation? And well, not next, they're already here. It's a live generation now. The 3 more points is let's continue to support each other and be aware of our own biases and being aware of our own self sometimes, and just celebrate each other. Take that time and say, yeah, well done. You know, you're doing a good job, you know. And yeah, and it goes on my next point. Let's just stop and celebrate. Look at what we've achieved. Look how far we've come. Because sometimes as women, sometimes we can be our worstest critic. We can be hard on ourselves because we see now, but we see we've got so much way to go, and we know this. But let's just stop, take a breath, and say, actually, yeah, we're going okay. There's more to go, we know, but let's stop and celebrate. And I think today's discussion is about a celebration as well as seeing what needs to be done. And yeah, believe in ourselves, you know. And I just want to say they're my few words, but thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. Yeah, have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, and for the beautiful way in which you expressed that all as well. I think it's a wonderful way to conclude. If I can thank all of those who have taken part today, all who have asked questions, if I can also thank Margaret for joining us and making a special time in your diary. It wouldn't have happened without you. And thank you, Sam and Marsha, for being our other panelists as well. So big thanks as well to the Fabian Women's Network, Fawcett, and the Co-op Women's Network. And I will hand over to Sara just to close our event. Thank you, Sara.
Thank you, Seema. Thank you everyone for putting this time aside to join us today. And thank you again to all of our speakers and all of our questioners. And Fabian Women's Network, I was just so reminded, Maria, when you're speaking, we've adopted 3 values of sisterhood, solidarity and service. And I was just reflecting on those as you were speaking. So that's the spirit we go forward in, and that kind of call to celebrate, I think, is really needed in this current week with all of its new uncertainties. So sisters, celebrate yourselves, celebrate those around you, and may we continue in sisterhood, solidarity and service. Please do look up our forthcoming events on Equal Pay Day, one this evening about Kamala Harris. You can find us on Twitter, on Facebook, and let's keep looking out for each other in these really extraordinary times and keep lifting up other women and raising the voices of those that we don't hear, so that we can create a better world, whatever the next few days, weeks and months bring. Thank you so much, sisters, and have a great evening, whatever you're up to. Bye-bye.